Thank you for coming to my talk. I was a little bit worried nobody would come. And so feel free to comment and ask questions as we go, because I think it's a bit nicer if we're actually talking about the information rather than me just standing here and talking about whatever. So yeah, that's me. That's the. Now, somebody's already guessed where I'm from. Anybody else want to hazard a guess?
Georgia.
No. Long way from Georgia. I think. Thank you. Anybody want to guess where in New Zealand? Instant A+ for anybody who can work out where I'm from. No, it's mostly people at home who know where I'm from. Joe, can you do the slide? Joe's going to do the slides. So this is where I'm from. This is, if you think of New Zealand's a group of islands, there's a North Island and a South Island. North Island, East Coast. In the middle, there's a very large bay. And so this is where I'm from. We're made up of different tribes. It's pronounced Maori here. I think a lot of it's a pronunciation, but we say Maori. But there's a but to that. Maori is only a post-colonization word that we use for ourselves because it just means normal. Maori means normal person. If you ask me if you want some normal water, you'd say wai Maori, which is normal water. So when other people came to our shores and asked us what we were, we said, well, we're normal. And that's how we got our name. So we're not one people. We were never one people until we were colonized. And we needed, if you like, a new pan-identity to describe ourselves. So we're from different tribes. We're from migration groups. I'm from the last migration group. So we've been there about 600 years. There were different migrations. We picked up different people all around the place. It was a good few thousand years before we got to where we're going, to our new homeland. So there's a very long and rich history that you probably won't hear about because as far as the history books are concerned, pretty much some of us got there accidentally on a boat and then Captain Cook came. and that's pretty much what you hear about our history. So I'm Kahungunu, which is the name of my tribe. And in terms of bands, it's Hawea, Ngati Hori, Ngati Whenua, and Whatui Apiti. So that's the bands. But as I said, I'm from a different tribe. We do speak a bit differently. Back in the day, we did look more different from each other than we do now because there's been lots of intermarriage too. So, but I can go to a meeting in some of the big cities and someone will come up to me and say, oh, you wouldn't be Kahungunu, would you? Yes. So I look like a Kahungunu. So I found once I went to the big city and there were other people. So yeah, this is where I'm from. This is and when we introduce ourselves, this is what we say. To introduce ourselves always when we're in a group of strangers. So the first thing we talk about is the migration that we came with. So who were our original people? For Menes Takitimu. That's the first thing we say. Ko Takitimu te waka. Ko Tukituki te awa. So this is my river. It's called the Tukituki. So that's the next part of my identity. This is our mountain, Kahuanaki, which means great lump sitting alone, which is it's fenced off and owned by a farmer. We can't go there without permission. Just saying, don't get me started on that. So, and that's why we talk about it. And then we talk about our bands, which I've told you about, and then we talk about our individual, like long houses. So mine is Waipatu and Te Paru. So that's our identity that we give. And I think the most important thing for us is where we come from and the land that we come from. We don't say our name first. Our name comes last at the very end. All this comes first. And so when you're sitting there and you hear someone and they say, where they're from, you hear the name of the mountain, you know exactly who they are. And that's the reason for it. So it looks nice. It looks very pretty. I like to look at it, but it's also kind of sad. And I'll explain why it's sad. It's because all our native forest is gone. Down here is English willow. The English came, or the British came, and decided to create a little Britain on exactly the other side of the world. So away went all our forests. In came the English willow. Our river's polluted. They farm cows up here now. So the river that I learnt to swim in as a child, my children can't swim in summer because of all, there's no polite way to say this, cow shit that comes down the river. I can't go to my mountain. Not only has it got no tree, it hasn't got any trees on it anymore in the lower reaches. It's fenced off, and there's a guy up there farming sheep, and we can't go up there in case we disturb the sheep. And our animals are gone. Most of our fish are gone. Most of our birds are gone. So it looks beautiful, but it's been completely changed from what it was. And that's the thing for us in our history, is how we love to look at it, but also we have that sadness of what's missing, what's been taken. And we're working very hard to change things. But under the current system, it's a little difficult. So that's me. So I'm going to talk about Indigenous methodologies. And as I said, but Ole, I'm glad you're all here because it probably doesn't sound like the most exciting topic, especially after Fool's Crow. But feel free to throw your thoughts in. I'm not saying in any of this is only one way to look at. This is a way to look at it. I'm also going to use some phrases in here, and I'll try to remember to point them out, that I don't wholly agree with actually, but it's sort of a matter of mutual understanding. Some of the things I put in here I've had to translate from my own language, and it doesn't really work. A lot of our concepts, they don't translate. You can't say them in English. So it's taken me a while to actually try and think through how am I going to explain this to an audience who doesn't speak my language. Sometimes I'll stop and think. There's two reasons for that. One is that I got jet lag, and it took me about 3 days to get here. So I'm still a little bit in the land of dreams. And the other is that sometimes I have to stop and translate, and I get stuck, and I can't think what to say next. So that if you see me just looking a bit blank, feel free to just ask a question at that point. Hopefully it'll come to me. Yeah. And so, yeah, this is essentially, and I have, the first little bit I'm going to talk about was actually adapted from Graham Smith's work. I want to acknowledge Graham Smith. I don't know if any of you have read Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's book on decolonising research methods. It's a really good book. That's her husband. And so, yeah, I acknowledge Linda Smith in this as well. So jump on. So these are essentially what I thought, the features of Indigenous methodologies. And not everyone is going to agree with this. But in my work, this is certainly, one of the ways that has helped guide me when I try and think about, how do I approach things from an Indigenous perspective when there are so many competing perspectives, when there are so many voices that seem to say, well, that's just not the way you do it. That's not the way it's done. It's not the way we did it before. Why are you doing that now? And all those kind of things. So the first thing is the obvious one. It's being related to being Indigenous. Connected to the philosophies and principles of an Indigenous worldview. That's really important. I'll talk about that a bit later on. But if you don't know the underlying philosophies and you don't know the underlying principles, you're not really going to be engaging with Indigenous research, because what's underpinning what you're doing? I've got there a bit about the validity and legitimacy of Indigenous ways. So that's another thing, just taking it for granted. Of course it's legitimate. Of course it's valid. Of course it is. We shouldn't need to argue that it's legitimate and valid. It just is. And I have actually had to argue that it's legitimate and valid, but we shouldn't need to do that. We shouldn't need to be drawn into conversations about justifying who we are. Struggle for our autonomy over our own cultural well-being. And I think that's the thing for all Indigenous peoples. it's a struggle that we have. We struggle for autonomy, of our research, over our knowledge, over our sovereignty. And we all have that struggle in one way or another. Giving directives is the relative value and ownership of data. Now, this has been a really contentious issue at home. One of the very common ways to do research has been for somebody at a university. I work for a university, I have done for years, so I understand this, and I understand how the funding process goes, and I know why these things are done this way. But is to draw up a research project and then come out and see us and say, what do you think? Is this okay to do? And we'll give you a copy of the article when we write it. That's not autonomy. It's not consultation. It's making all the other decisions first and then asking you, do you like this one? It's a bit like, trying to get a kid to wear a t-shirt. Would you like the red one? So when we talk about autonomy, there's your problem right there, is that we have a lot of that. And I said, I work for a university, I understand why this happens. But at home, most of the majority of research is done that way. Someone else has come up with an idea. Fairly often it's already been through an ethics committee at the university, and then they're allowed to come out. It's interesting. You're allowed to come out and you're allowed to talk to the people once the university has said, okay. Well, why is that? Why does the university get to be the gatekeeper to our community? I think it should be the other way around. Come out to our community and talk to us first, then you can go to the university. But it doesn't happen like that. I'm trying to change a lot of things. That's one of the things. Or the community group, come down with researchers coming down to a community group, and there'll be the same group of elders there. And they're mostly there for the cup of tea and the biscuit they get, because no one else really wants to come. And they'll sit there and say yes, and they'll enjoy themselves and have the good morning. And then and they'll sign the paper, and then it'll go off. And it'll go through the ethics committee. We'll stamp that up and say, oh, that's great. You consulted with the community. That must be fine. I've seen some terrible mistakes made from that. And the ownership of data, what you're going to do with it. We've had trouble with the media picking up on research and using it to portray us as a people in extremely negative light. And that's where ownership of data comes in. So who gets to say these things? Who gets to talk about us? Who gets to talk about us in what ways? We had a thing, which I'll mention probably a bit later, called the warrior gene. That's a warrior with an O-R, not a warrior, a warrior, someone who fights. So that went out and took some blood samples, and from a population of Māori men in prison, and came up with this theory that the reason why there were and this is their phrasing, the reason why there were so many Māori men in prison is because we have this gene. We have this gene that makes us violent, put us in the wrong situation, give us bad parents or whatever, turns us violent, and off we go to prison. You will still see that referred to in international literature, the warrior gene, the proof they were actually quite brutal and savage people. It's a nonsense. The research was terrible. It was badly designed. Essentially, I'm not surprised they found what they found because of the way they designed it. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling thing. But now, because of that, we forever have to come up in the literature when this sort of thing comes up, the idea of the warrior gene. And where we see it, we don't see that anybody critiqued it or that the people who it was about got mad about it. We just see that, oh, they found this warrior gene. I could go on about that too. That's another long thing. But that's an example of what happens when someone wants to come along and study your genes. It's all very well, but what are they going to do with that information? How are they going to look at these things? It was a badly designed research project. But now we have the warrior gene to contend with, and that fits in so well with this idea of the savage. This fighting, brutal people who murdered the British and smacked their heads in and shot them and things like that. Whereas we spent a lot of time, hunting and fishing and a bit on gardening and doing craft work. We were warriors about, 0.1% of the time. but it's the warrior that's become, mythologized in what's largely the Western mind, because that's not who we are as a people. It's who we had to be sometimes, but it's this sort of reductionist idea, and the warrior gene played right into all of that. Aiming to make a positive difference. Well, the warrior gene made a negative difference, I can tell you that much. There is research that they might say, come out and say, well, yes, this will make a positive difference for you, but actually a positive difference for who, where, when, what is this positive difference going to be? Just some knowledge that, we have a such and such rate of heart disease in this particular area. Is that really a positive difference for us? Actually, it's not. But often argued that it is. So positive difference requires a lot of critique, actually, because we're often, the message that this is research will make a positive difference when the positive difference that it's talking about is sort of fairly hard to discern, I'll put it that way. And the use of knowledge generated by the people who generated that. So that is the participant community. Using the participant community to actually be able to use that knowledge, because that's the positive difference right there. It doesn't help us if we have, 10 articles in the British Medical Journal. It doesn't. I mean, so what? That's not a knowledge we can take and use. So these are they don't have to be, all of these together, but these on a broad brush look at Indigenous methodologies. These are the kind of things that come out of it. Okay, more lots of words. Yeah, decolonisation of knowledge. Now I'm going to talk a little bit here. You can see I've put the Western knowledge in quotes. We've had big arguments at home about what is knowledge. I mean, honestly, there's been pages and pages written on it. And there's this term Western knowledge. Now, I'm using Western knowledge because we kind of all know what that means. That's the other knowledge, the knowledge of the coloniser. I actually personally don't agree with the term Western knowledge. Western Europe is a big place. Western Europe has multiple knowledge traditions. You sort of get these explanations about, there was the Enlightenment movement, there was René Descartes and his graphs and his positivism and dualism, and out of that came this Western knowledge that apparently colonised us. That's a very reduced view. And I think in asking for or explaining the respect around our knowledge, I think it's also important to acknowledge Western Europe and the many knowledge traditions that actually come from the West. And some of them, I found are a lot closer to our knowledge traditions than what might be supposed when people talk about Western knowledge. You had there's a German school of philosophy in Freiburg in Germany, who had people like Heidegger who talked a lot about the oneness. He called it Dasein in German. So it was the oneness of the person, the environment, and the heavens. That sounds pretty familiar to me. I can relate to that. And he certainly didn't talk about positivism. Arne Naess from Norway talked about ecoposophy, which is the philosophy of the ecology as one. Even if you look at architecture, you have architects like Le Corbusier who talked about how homes need light and they need green plants and they need environment, because our original home was in the environment and we need to have that with us to keep well. So there are a lot of things in Western knowledge that actually we do have some affinity with. But I'll say Western because you know what I mean when I talk Western, the colonising things. And where I've got there, it doesn't mean that we need to reject Western knowledge. We can use it as a tool, no problem. We can take from it what we want. We can leave it if we want, but we don't have to automatically reject it and say that it can't be Indigenous because it's Western. But we can do that. We can take Western methods. The Western method is just a tool. we can still fulfill all those things, those features of Indigenous methodologies that I showed you, and use some Western tools. Why not? It's a tool. It's all it is. I've got down there's an example I thought of, if Indigenous carver, like someone from home, they use an English chisel. That doesn't mean they're making an English carving. It just means that an English chisel is pretty useful for the job. So don't automatically reject a method because it's a Western method. And you can also have Indigenous methods, but not necessarily an Indigenous methodology. So you're probably thinking, what is she talking about here? Here's an example. A university might be doing all this health study and come in and they might talk to our elders in a culturally appropriate way. But the way that they're generating the philosophy, the thinking behind that research might be wholly an outside thinking. What they do with that information might be wholly for the benefit of somebody else and not the elders that they're talking to, who they might not even ask the community if this is okay. So you might see an Indigenous method in use. That doesn't mean that the research is inconsistent with Indigenous methodology. The Indigenous methodology is the thinking behind the research. It's what drives what you're doing, what motivates what you're doing. It's not necessarily just what you're seen to be doing. And I think, as colonized peoples, what we share again, this other knowledge tradition came to our shores, and most of us, it was about a couple of hundred years ago. And most of the research that's been done with us has been research with an ideology from somewhere else. And it's been research into people. So it's not research with people. It's still, to this day, it's not really research with people. It's research on people. And as soon as you do research on people, you're creating an other. Them, that group, they, it's information on them. If you just think of the difference between information on someone and information with someone, when you're talking with someone, you're talking a partnership, preferably an equal partnership. And we're still working on that too. So when we do research from somewhere else, by someone else, we get into this comparative research. And what really brought this home to me is I went to an Indigenous cancer conference, and everybody that day, every talk that I went to, people got up and they showed these statistics, first 10 minutes approximately of every presentation was all about bad rates of cancer. So bad rates of colon cancer, bad rates of lung cancer, and on and on and on. And at the end of the day, I wasn't feeling very good. I'm thinking, oh, geez, I don't feel too good today. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, I've just heard all these messages about how actually we're really crap. I've heard message after message after message that actually we're not as good, we're not the same, we're different, we're worse than white people. And sometimes, I'm not saying that that's always inappropriate. Sometimes it is appropriate when talking equity. But often it's used in an inappropriate way. And this is to make the white person the gold standard, the norm against who we are measured as people. And that's, somebody else. We are, I put almost always, but in my experience it's been always compared to the most socially powerful group and always found wanting. So we get this, we just disproportionately high rates of imprisonment, bad, you name it, bad health, bad genes, bad parents, screwing up our kids. Oh, sorry. Sorry, sometimes I'm tired. Sometimes the language slips a little bit, be a bit more formal. And we're just forever these scarred people, the victims and the people that need help, and therefore the people who don't have agency, the people who are reliant on others to somehow be better, and we don't really feel like we're going to be better because of these continual messages. So when you see this kind of thing, and you will see it, there, yes, disproportionate rates. Have a think first about what that means. And the other thing about that, you might say, well, double the proportion of Māori men are in prison as to white men. Okay, but what does that actually mean?
Discrimination.
It's discrimination, it's racism, it's social injustice, it's poverty. It's all those things. It's not because we're actually born that way or or our communities stuff us up. It's all these other things, and it's a kind of an easy way to sort of avoid the whole social justice thing by just saying, oh, well, they've got bad genes or they've got bad parents or, whatever else comes into it. There's something else I was going to say about that gold standard thing. I can't remember. Sorry, tired brain, it's gone out of my head. There was something important that I wanted to talk to you about.
I'll just make a comment.
Oh, thank you.
The same thing comes here.
Yeah.
I sit on the State Senate Judiciary Committee, and so I have all these statistics, but 30% of every person incarcerated in Montana State Prison is Native American.
Yep.
We only make up 7%, barely 7% of the population of the state of Montana, but we have 30% of the men in state prison is Native American. 30% of the women in state prison is Native American. 30% of the children in foster care is Native American.
Yep.
So you're looking at discrimination and racism, and like you said, in comparison of the gold standard of someone else. So,
yeah.
So it's pervasive, I guess, throughout the
it
world, and then especially Indigenous communities.
And often it's not used as an equity basis. It's used to show how bad we are. And it's when we're talking equity, it's fine. Outside of that, I think it's not so fine. But the other thing I just remembered about the gold standard thing is that let's say 10% of Native women die of a certain amount of cancer, and 5% of white women die of that same cancer. Well, is somebody trying to tell me that 5% is okay? If it's a preventable cancer, oh, that's fine because we're the same as the white people, where they're obviously not getting treatment either because it's 5%. So why do we want to aim to be the same as the white person? Why can't we just aim for not being in prison? Aim for not having that preventable cancer. So it's a very subtle way of massaging thinking about who we are in comparison to someone else. And if one Native woman dies of a preventable cancer, that's one too many. I don't care what someone else's proportion is, I care what mine is. And I want that prevented. There's a South African activist called Stephen Biko. I don't know, some of you might have heard of him. Sadly, he was beaten to death by police in the late 70s in South Africa. And he talked about this quite a lot. He talked about this constant differentiation, this constant message that you're not as good as. And I'll just sort of paraphrase him. I can't remember the exact words, but what he said was, when the language that you speak, when the music that you listen to, when the songs that you sing, when the environment that you're in, when they're all the things of the white man, you start to feel that there's something about your language, your way of being, your songs that aren't as good. And it's only a small step from that, unfortunately, to feeling that you're not as good. Because there's something to do with my culture that isn't as good, and that something is to do with my brownness, and that's me. And I'm not as good. And so with research and methodology, we have to watch what we do and think about the way that we're coming at this sort of stuff, so that we're not promoting this kind of stuff. I've had a few disagreements over it. But, go Joe. So what do we get? I've talked about this. We get, this. We get this at every conference. Rates of bad things, and here we go, get native. Nice, I made a brown collar for the native one. There we go, we get that. Yep, all the bad thing, 1, 2, and 3, and we're the worst at everything. Next one, Joe. Oh, and bad things over time, so there we are, the more bad things over time, all that sort of stuff. And we see that time and time again, outside of the realm of equity, which is where I have my problem with it. So something that a relative of mine, Morna Jackson, unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago now, he talked a lot about this kind of stuff. And what he talked about was Indigenous traditions, because he'd been around quite a bit. And so what he said about Indigenous traditions was that if you make a comparison, first and foremost, you compare the people under study with the context to which they belong. You compare them with the culture that shapes them, with the history of what has happened to that culture. You compare with all those things. You don't sit down and first and foremost, and often only, the thing you do is compare them to somebody else. Because if you're comparing, that's all you do is comparing to somebody else, that's not helpful for us. But the other kinds of comparisons, where we've come from.
Me and Roy were talking about decolonizing. And I'm ready to really decolonize. But him, he likes to get Christmas and presents. You can't let it go.
Oh, well, sometimes you've just got to have a little bit of that area to work on, otherwise you've got nothing to do. Got to have some challenges in life. The thing I was talking with a Māori woman in a community, and she said some scientists had come out and they'd had a talk, and they had told her that the reason why we have so much diabetes in our community is because we have bad genes. And this very elaborate story of nearly starving back in the day and being on these boats for months at a time, sailing all around the Pacific, and we needed to put on all this weight, and we wanted to eat all the time, and we come and we got good food suddenly, and we all get diabetes. But the effect of that was for her to believe that she was simply going to get sick and die from diabetes, because she was made that way. That was her genes. The scientists had come and told her that that's why she had diabetes. Now, I don't know actually what they said. Sometimes people can get different messages from what was meant. But it had a very powerful effect. It had a disempowering effect, because it's something you can't change. And that actually quite affected on me when she told me that, because I wanted so much to say, no. But, when somebody comes along with the scientist hat, I mean, I'm a scientist. But, the sort of scientist comes with all the language and the genetic studies and all these sorts of things. It's hard to combat that when someone's just taken it into themselves, and very likely they've had messages all their life that there's something wrong with them, they're not as good. And then, well, why should I do anything different, or why should I try? Because I've just got this thing that's wrong with me. And I was upset about that. I wanted to know who it was, but she couldn't remember. Joe? Those are big words. I remember when I first came across these words at university, I was so bored. I had all these little kids at home, and it was an afternoon lecture, kind of about this time of day when people are feeling tired. And I remember sitting there and my eyes just about rolling back in my head thinking, why do I have to know this stuff? It's so boring. It's my undergrad degree. I've since then come to appreciate these concepts and actually talk about them. But yeah, my first time I came across them wasn't very positive. I just sat there thinking, what is all this about? But I'll get back to this. We talk about the research process. We talk about ontology, epistemology, the research question, methodology, method, those kind of things. We kind of line them all up in a linear fashion. They're not actually linear. You kind of go backwards and forwards in between the two. But the easiest way to think, I've sort of changed some of the wording in here. Joe, can you jump to the next one? So for ontology, I just say, well, what is there to know? And for an Indigenous methodology, this is just the most important first step, that you know what there is to know. That might sound really basic, like of course I know what there is to know. Well, but do you? If I were doing a study with a group, how do I know how do I have any idea about what they know? I don't. What could I know? And I see this in research a lot where people, they might jump immediately, because my background's in public, they might jump immediately in health research to, I think I want to do an intervention, I want to weigh people and measure people, and I'll see If, you know, if they're fitter by dimension, then I'll consider my intervention to have worked, and that's all good. But what else could you know about wellness? And I see people skip this and run right to the method part of assuming that you know what wellness is for a community. Yeah, we do this a lot at university, that we assume that we know what wellness is, we assume that we know how to measure it, so we'll decide what it is and how to measure it before we go talk to anybody. And when you do that, and I was going to, got a case study at the end, I'll just start talking about it now. When you do that, so one of the research projects I worked on was called Housing and Health for Māori Families. So, and a lot of the research done previously, how do we do housing research and health? Well, we go and we measure temperature, we measure humidity, and we look at dampness and things like that. And then we might look at respiratory function and that sort of stuff. Well, that's all well and good, sure, but what else is there to know about wellness? Well, there's lots more to know about wellness, but if I don't even ask myself the question of what's to know, I'm just going to think that that's what wellness is. Very narrow. And so you might want to go and you might want to actually find out what the people that you're working with think wellness is before you start trying to tell them what their wellness is. And we see that far more often. We see the imposition of a wellness standard on Indigenous communities. Someone else from outside deciding what your wellness is and how that's going to be measured. Well, you'll be well when your rates of heart disease have gone down. Now at home, nobody subscribes to that. I mean, just the old people just don't think like that. But that's what gets imposed. And that's what happens when you don't ask yourself what there is to know, you don't consult the community first, and you go all the way through, you end up with these very structured and narrow-looking studies that don't ever really tap wellness because you never asked about it. You've decided already what wellness is for someone. And that's where having an Indigenous worldview is critical. I get asked, well, from non-Indigenous researchers, well, if I'm not Indigenous, do you think I can do Indigenous research? Well, yes, you can, but you really need to understand the worldview and the principles and values of the community that you're working with. If you don't, then you can't. If you don't have that worldview, then you're not going to be able to use that lens to look at to create your method. You're not going to use that lens to evaluate your data. And essentially, you're going to be yet again another researcher from someone else doing something else. Yeah, I said, beware thinking that you know what there is to know before you've done any research or had any discussions. That happens a lot. Yeah, I see that more often than not, actually. I had an interesting experience where we went out, I got asked to go out and research the health needs of a local community. And from the way that the government health funder was talking, this was all about, well, you know, they probably need more nurses. We think they need more nurses because they've got high heart disease and they've got this, that, and the other, and we're not doing enough screening on this population. So I thought, oh, well, okay, well, I'm actually going to go out and ask them. Before the government funds another nurse with a map and a tank of gas and a box of equipment in the car, let's just ask the people what they want. Right? Nobody wanted another heart nurse. That wasn't there. What they wanted, what they saw as the monitor for wellness in their communities as an outcome of the wellness problem, shall we say, was the addictions. And the old people would say, well, look, I've had my life. I don't need another nurse visit. But what I want is for something to be done about what's happening with the children. I had a very sad conversation with a 13-year-old girl. I was asking her, you know, from what do you think your community needs? If the government was going to come in here and help you guys be well, what do you want? She said, I want my dad to stop beating up my mum. If that can happen, I'll be much more well. And that was the crux of it. But if we could have come along and just gone, oh, well, epidemiological studies show that too much of this and too much of that, so let's just put in those, often based on those stats that I showed you, let's have a nurse in a car and a tank of gas. And then, of course, people won't be turning up to see the nurse because that's not what they really want. And it's not for our government, I say, to decide on behalf of us what we need. It's another argument. Epistemology, another, yeah, we'll just get rid of that word. The way I put that is, what is there to know? We have a fundamental question, what is there to know, right? So we've had that's the ontological part. What is there to know? And then the other one that comes out of this, okay, well, what's valuable to know? What's useful to know? What knowledge am I valuing here? Am I valuing a lower rate of heart disease? Am I valuing what a 13-year-old girl tells me that she needs for her community to help wellness? What knowledge, where is it coming from? I had a disagreement actually with the government funding agency. It was about, it was along these lines of well, what, sorry, my brain's gone again. Yeah, I'll just leave that. I'll park that one there. It'll come to me in a minute. Yeah, it was around the wellness stuff, I know that. It was around what do we value? And it was fairly obvious to me that the government valued a whole bunch of things that were probably upside down from what our values were. But that was going into the funding algorithms. And it's very hard for people in power to give any of that power up. You know, it just is. They just don't want to do it because whose hands are on the steering wheel? Who's driving the bus? And who's the passengers in the bus? Is there, how can I put it, is there brown hands on the steering wheel or is there white hands on the steering wheel? And that's a constant argument. You know, well, passengers are we the driver? We want to be the driver, of course we do. We want to go where we want to go. But, you know, getting those hands off the steering wheels is quite hard because, you know, those people, they're not good with money. They'll just spend it on their relative. Next minute, their cousin will have all our funding money, so we have to administer it for them. Or they'll waste it on something they don't need. And on it goes. All these so-called reasons for not giving up control of that steering wheel.
Isn't that called paternalism?
Yeah, we're doing a talk on that tomorrow. We got a whole talk on paternalism. I won't even go there. And yeah, somewhat automatically, you know, more valid, more reliable, more logical. We hear about the scientific method. I don't have a problem with the scientific method. It's a tool. But when someone wants to use a specific kind of scientific method just because it's innately better, that's what I have an issue with. So, come down to the research question. What do I want to know? And there's some, like, these are actual research questions. Most of them are PhD questions that students were trying to work on. They've got their needed work. This is one of them. But, you know, I found that if students aren't guided, and these are all native students or Indigenous students, if Indigenous students aren't guided around this, and this, you'll notice that this comes from that deficit talk that I talked about earlier, then these are the kind of questions that students tend to think about because they haven't been guided in this way. So this is one of them. Why are Native women vulnerable to domestic violence? Well, hold up. Hold up on that question. Okay, why are you framing Native women as vulnerable here? Why use the word vulnerable? That was interesting to me. I mean, there's a kind of a loaded comment there. To domestic violence. Is it only women who are vulnerable? If you're going to say vulnerable, who else is involved? You know, it's actually, when you start to unpack it, it becomes the kind of deficit that we were talking about. And you can tell that it came straight out of a stat that said Native women experience so many more incidents of domestic violence than non-Native women. And out pops this kind of question. And then if you're going to go out and talk to women about it and you're going to analyse, you've got vulnerability in your head. So when you see that data coming out, you're going to see indicators of vulnerability in that data, and you're going to end up talking about it because that was the way you asked the question. But you don't need to ask it that way. You could say, what are the factors of resilience for Native women who have suffered domestic violence? You could say something like that. And when you do that, when you ask it that way, you'll be looking at resilience factors. What might be more useful for an Indigenous population? Thinking about vulnerability or thinking about resilience? And this is how subtly these things work their way through students in universities and come out in these kind of questions. Disproportionate number of Māori in prison, well, that's kind of an obvious one. There are other ways you can ask that. Does it help me to know that these were disenfranchised kids who ended up in the education system that spat them out and ended up in prison? Is that actually, I don't know that that's all that helpful. It sort of implies that what I want to be is a proportionate number. Well, is that helpful? Does it empower Indigenous peoples? Is it going to be used by the community, the kind of data that question is going to generate? Here's another one. How can we create health messages so Māori people have a better understanding of the impacts of fat, salt and sugar in their diet? Oh boy. All right, better understanding. That's a code word for ignorance. So you're saying that Māori people are ignorant and they don't know what they're eating and that's why they're eating all this stuff, and if only we could just tell them in a better way, they'd understand and we'd educate them and then they go eat differently. Well, that's a different way of looking at it. Does that work? No, it doesn't work. You can tell people fat, salt and sugar all you like and it doesn't really change a lot. I mean, nutritionists in our community know that. But if we talk to Māori people, and this is actually some of my research was around this, was really about, and it was to do with wellness stuff actually, about what makes you well in terms of eating. Right? Fat, salt and sugar did not come into people's thinking at all. But what did come into people's thinking was traditional food, the naturalness of food, those kind of things. So now what I found, one of my jobs is I am program director for an addiction rehabilitation service. So we look at doing things like rehabilitating people from brain damage from drugs, those sorts of things. One of the things I talk to them about is about diet. And because I might be the program director, but I still go out and support the people. I don't sit around directing, do the little bit that's possible. And so we talk to people in a way that they understand within their own world of view, nothing to do with fat, salt and sugar, and hey, the diets are going better. Funny that. Because that third question is really about imposing. It's imposing a belief about food onto people and then wondering why they won't change when you discuss your belief with them that they don't share. Enlightened Māori on organ donation. Yeah, Māori, we don't like organ donation. It is such a violation to cut up a dead body. It really is. People do not want that to happen to their bodies. They don't want it to happen to their relatives. It's very, very strong. So there's been a big thing. Why won't Māori give their organs up? Oh no, we better go and educate them. We'll go and enlighten them on on what organ donation is all about. Well, actually, that's not the problem. We know all about organ donation. We know how wonderful it is. It's really good to give you organs, and people can have all these new lives and things. But actually, it's a massive cultural violation, and there's not any way you can talk to us about that that's going to change the fact that it is a cultural violation. But you can say some other things. So this is some examples of the the way colonised thinking creeps into research. All right, methodology. So I look at the methodology, and what is there to know? What's valuable to know? Is our methodology consistent with all that stuff? Very often people jump in with a research question. They've done a lovely literature research. They've found a gap in the literature. They're going to answer that gap, write 10 articles, go up the chain, get your PBRF, all that lovely stuff. They haven't actually considered this. Jumped straight in at the research question and gone from there. But if you don't consider what there is to know, you don't consider what's valuable to know, if you don't challenge Eurocentric knowledge systems and colonisation, you're not going to be doing an Indigenous methodology. It's not going to happen for you. I talked about tools. They do need to be consistent with your lens. I talked before about the chisel. A tool is a tool. You use it how you want. I've got an example there. If I want to understand Indigenous mental health, do I use a survey asking questions based on the DSM? And DSM is not my friend. I have to use it. As a psychologist, I've had to use it in the past. But do I really, if you really want us to understand Indigenous mental health, would you use the DSM to understand it? No, you would not. You wouldn't go near it. If I wanted to, if I had to, talk about depression symptomology in Indigenous population, I might have to refer to the DSM because the research is narrowed to the point that it gives me no freedom to do anything else. But what am I going to spit out there at that point? There's all this depressive symptomology out there for a population that the DSM was never based on? Probably. Is that going to do me any good? No, actually it won't. I'll just say that right there. So I say, which tool are you using? Whose knowledge systems are you using? If you're going to think about mental health, are you going to use the knowledge systems from somewhere else to think about our mental health? Well, you might want to. You might make the choice that, yes, you do want to. That's fine. But be aware that you are making the choice, that you are choosing that knowledge system and you are rejecting others. And you have to do that in research. You're always going to reject some knowledge system. It's the part of being a researcher, but just be aware that you're doing it. So this was it's a bit of a case study for public health. I already pretty much touched on this, but the questions that might fall out of that. What's a home? Am I going and assuming I know what a home is? Researchers often do. A home is not a house. They're two different things, and the English language has them separated, but not very well defined in terms of home. So I better know what a home is. What's health? Is it, like I said before, do I want to go measure temperature and dampness and housing quality and then look at respiratory illnesses? Is that all right? It might be all right, depending on the research you want to do. But this one, I really wanted Indigenous methodology, and doing it that way was not going to fit. Joe, jump on there. So what's a healthy home? If I go in and I decide that a healthy home means kids have fewer trips to hospital with asthma, fewer communicable diseases, I've already decided for someone else what a healthy home is without asking the community what it is. And actually, nobody I talked to in my survey ever said a healthy home was going to the hospital less. It was a very different thing. What is health? We're getting, again, we've got this sort of this innate kind of outside pressure to conform to the worldview that says, a home is a thing with four walls and the people in it, and that a health is this thing that I measure through these physical things of maybe going to the doctor or looking at your blood. And then I'm going to put those two together and I'm going to find out about what health is for an Indigenous community. I've just railroaded over completely any Indigenous worldview. I've imported a Eurocentric framework. I've done all those things. None of this sounds bad. I mean, some of the stuff, the research that comes out might be quite good. But is it what I would call an Indigenous methodology? No. You're in trouble already if you're going down that route and you're wanting to do more. You're wanting to honour that Indigenous voice. You're wanting to bring an authentic Indigenous thinking behind your research and behind the knowledge that you generate. You're imposing stuff on people already if you're starting to think along those lines. What knowledge do I value? What framework do I use? Principles and values. And we kind of bat those words around a bit, but what does it really mean? And so I've given some examples there of some, because as researchers, we all have biases. And biases aren't necessarily bad. We're all biased. We all have our own history. We all have our own ways of thinking about things. The thing is about acknowledging those and not pretending they don't exist. I mean, we have the sort of objectivist viewpoint that the unbiased researcher is looking through a window at the universe and describing what's in it. That's a fantasy. There is always an element of personal interpretation. So, what are some things, from my point of view, if I'm doing Indigenous research with my people? Principles and values. Interrelatedness. That's really important to us. Interrelatedness of all things. Our whole world is based on that thinking. Caring, support, hospitality for others. Care as a guardian. That's caring for everything. So that's caring for the world. It might be caring for your stream, your plants, your animals. That is to actually act as an active guardian for them. It's really important. Protective caring. It might be the way for caring for children. How the world works. Now I've got mana and Māori there. I could do a whole workshop on that. They're not translatable. All I've got is gives both the right and the ability to do something. That's all I could think. I'm sorry, I can only give you the most superficial kind of answer, but it's just an idea of what underpins the world, how we are as people, what identity is, how we operate. And when you see the world in a different way, you see different things in the data. So you ask different kind of questions. You use different kind of methods, but you see different things. And I found that quite obviously. I've been doing an exercise with a colleague of mine. She's a non-Indigenous person, and we look at the same data and we look at the themes that we see. And her themes and mine, sometimes are related, sometimes they're completely different. But that's where the lens comes in. So she's thinking in her way, she only sees a certain stuff. I think in my way, I see a certain stuff. We both look at it together. So there's a lot of stuff on Māori information that she completely misses because she just doesn't have the thinking behind it. She doesn't see in their words what I see. When someone talks about the importance of giving a gift to a visitor. When I hear that, I know exactly what that's all about. I know that that's about caring, it's about hospitality, it's about showing respect for that person. She sees it, but she doesn't understand the depth of it. And so we build up different themes. So from the same data, we get different stuff. So again, be aware of what's up here, be aware of what you're thinking. Because that can completely change what you see in the data, and it'll change what you find. It'll change the knowledge that comes out of what you do. There's a couple of slides on here. Yeah, if you want these slides, just give me your email address and I've just packed it because I thought someone might be interested in IPA. The main thing about interactive phenomenological analysis is that it's about honouring the person's worldview. It's about stepping into that person's shoes with them and working to understand their world, their reality as they construct it. That's the best way I can put it. That's why it's one of my preferred methods. And you can have, in Indigenous research we get this thing, but you only talk to 10 people. That's not enough. How is that representative? Well, there's a few things about that. It depends, sample size depends on things like your size of your population. It depends on the diversity of your population. 10 can be fine. It also depends on things like how rich is your data? What are you doing with it? Are you wanting to generate a theory of how things are? You don't need many people to generate a theory. When you're generating theory, you're not worried about representativeness. But that's something that we often get sort of poked at as Indigenous researchers are, oh, but your sample size is small. How can you say that, that's representative of your sample in your population? Which is actually a misreading and a misunderstanding, I guess, of what sample size is all about in relation to the methodology that you use. And it also honours the interpretive process. So the person interprets their world, they discuss it with you, the researcher. The researcher then interprets what that person has told them. So there's a double interpretation going on there. Yep, and I'm around for the rest of the conference. Anyone wants to talk to me about this, please do. I just put it in there. Yeah, there's a lot more words. I've already pretty much gone over this. But insiders and outsiders, yeah. Oh, it's okay. They give you the wrong one. Okay, we've got the wrong ones. Or we could just write something else on the top. Yeah, I've already said that stuff. The only thing I point out there, language, culture, and history, it already exists in some form. So that's the context in which we as people arrive at. And that's what we explore, I think, as an Indigenous researcher. That's really what we're looking at. Yeah, it's just about analysis. And again, and this is again consistent with Indigenous methodology. You don't have to code all the data. You don't have to put it all into units of meaning. You can actually put your Indigenous lens on and interpret what you see in relation to your own culture, your own history, what's happened to you, all those sorts of things. You don't have to sit there and code and make everything into a theme. I think I've only got a couple more to go. All right, yeah, it's a full lot of information here. So this is something, so what did I find? We have this thing that we have this so-called Māori model of health that the government uses a lot. And they talk about the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual aspects of health. That health is made up of these four things. And I noticed actually the IHS has this on their website, which is interesting to me. That they make up all these four things, and that's what health is. So for Native people, we have these four things here that makes up well-being. I've always been suspicious about that, because to me that doesn't actually sound like any Indigenous model that I know. So when I did some research on it, I actually looked up where that comes from. It comes from a United Nations working paper in 1946. It comes straight out of Europe, the physical, emotional, and spiritual. And there's a guy called Berntsen, and they were paraphrasing his work, who was also European. And I can see that in the construction, because it's this idea that there are things, there are discrete parts to health. There are these domains, and we, to be well, we need to be well in all these domains. It actually doesn't make much sense. When you really think about it, nobody who's going to be 100% in all those things? How do we measure it? What does it mean to be 100% spiritually well? Who knows? I mean, I don't know. So when I went out and I did some research, I found that only Māori who had been exposed to that message thought in that way, which was very interesting to me, because it showed how much these things can actually almost colonise our thinking. Because people had sort of been to university, or they'd learnt this sort of stuff, or they worked in the health system, they would talk about these four things as being a Māori way of talking about health. But when I talked to people who hadn't ever seen it before, they never talked about it. Old people, the oldest person I interviewed was 97. Youngest person was 22. If they hadn't ever seen that, they didn't think like that. So it shows you how our thinking gets shaped. We go off to university and we're taught these models and these ways of looking at things. We're also, in terms of Māori, we're also told that it's a Māori model. Well, it's not. It's something that Māori engage with, yes, and we can look at that. Yeah, we can engage with that. We can relate to that. But is it a Māori model? No, it's a European one. So when I talked to especially the old people, you had this whole other conceptualised health. There were no bits. There were no parts to it. It was this sort of fluid, changing, evolving thing that sort of ebbed backwards and forwards naturally. There was no idea that you had to be 100% of health and stay there. That's a very European kind of idea. It was, yeah, well, you know, your health comes backwards and forwards, it changes. And when I looked at the data, you know, what could I see in there? I could see Indigenous values and principles in that, but that's because I had them as a researcher. If I hadn't had those, I wouldn't know what they were when I saw them. I wouldn't know whether when the old people talked to me about these things, and they didn't use those kind of words, but I wouldn't know that that's what I was looking at. It was the best research I've ever. One elder, she was in a rest home. She is 91. She talked to me for 8.5 hours, and about every hour or two I'd say, well, Auntie, as we'd say Auntie as a term of respect, are you getting tired at all? We've been talking for a long time. Oh no, I'm really enjoying this. So it was 8.5 hour interview, and she talked to me about all this wonderful stuff. And you know, you might get taught at university that, you know, you do your hour and you do your semi-structured interview and it should take about this much. I let her talk. And she told me the most beautiful and incredible stories that really helped shape how I thought about what this data was telling me. You know, I might get told that that's not a good research technique, and I shouldn't have sat there for 8.5 hours, and I should have stuck to my, you know, my sheet. But actually, it was just the most valuable thing. She's still alive, and I'm going to go and see her when I get back. But that's that thing of knowing, having your lens, being strong in your lens and who you are, and being able to hear what those people are telling you without thinking that it has to be in a certain category, without thinking, oh yes, that must be spiritual health that she's talking about right now. Let all of that go. Let all of that framework go. Just listen. I think we're just about there. Oh, we are. Questions. Really wasn't we? No. Ask away.
You know, there's, in all of this research on, and we're talking on your people, Indigenous, is there any positive outcomes that comes out of research on Indigenous people or people in general? I mean, well, let me see. Okay, so story. All right, I got an anthropology degree.
Yep, okay. Good.
And so when WIC, women, children, infants and children or whatever, yeah, thank you. When it came out, all of these community health nurses went into the Black communities, inner city communities, and they were finding all these little children, or these children that were being born to these Black women. And they were probably between 4 and 6 pounds. And so they came out and they said, oh, it's the diet. They're not getting enough milk, they're not getting enough food so that they can have larger babies, or, you know, and using the Caucasian child, which is between 6 and 8 pounds when they're born, and comparing them. And so what happened there was that they never looked at the physiology of the race.
Yeah.
And so Black women, they may be big, they may be, you know, carrying a lot of weight, because that's what they were in Africa. They had to carry the water, and so they never thought about that. And so the birth canal was too small to carry a larger baby.
All right, so the babies are small.
And so Caucasian women can carry that 6 to 8 pound baby. Now let's talk about Indian women, Native American women. We can carry up to a 12-pound baby.
Yeah, I was going to say, our babies we're always being told our babies are too big and they're too fat and you know, because they come out and they're huge.
That's because it was our climate and geography and our history of why we have to have our babies that are ready to take care of themselves. I mean, you know, not take care of themselves, but, you know, be prepared
nice and fat
for the world, let's put it that way. But what came out of that research was this fantastic program that helped women, families across the board to get nutrition. Has that happened in
at home?
Your world?
Really? No. We get a lot of how we are is to do with colonisation, you know, and so we get a lot of stats that might say actually it's unusual for us to have small babies. So we're on the big side of things, but we're often told our kids are too big, or they use the BMI. It's the idea of the white standard. They use the BMI. It doesn't work for us. We're too heavily muscled. You know, guys are like bricks. Joe see them. Joe was there, and he was in between two Māori guys who are artists, and he looked like a little boy. Joe with his little skinny legs. Sorry, I mean, you know, but his guys like this. So we get told we're too big. Yeah, sure. Sometimes we're carrying some extra weight we don't need to, but it's the norm thing that comes in, so it tends to be used in a not positive way.
Next question. Okay.
Wait.
So,
I just have to say, on the news the other day, they're questioning the BMI. But they're coming at it from a black person perspective, but I was just watching it on the news where they're pushing back on BMI as a way to measure our health. And it's coming from the black perspective, black people. So just had to put that in there.
thank you.
Yeah.
Then the other thing is when COVID hit, and if everybody was looking at all the studies that came out of China right away, China just went and took all these studies. And one of the studies that came out, being the anthropologist I am, was that the people with type A blood grouping was hit the hardest and suffered
I remember
the
that,
most deaths. Well, guess who has a type A blood grouping? Well, the Maori for one, and the Blackfoot.
We do.
Blackfoot.
Yeah, I'm A+.
So we worked this very hard. According to our, we help in the burial, the funerals expenses in our tribe here. Our treasurer, during this 2-year period or 3-year period, the tribe itself had, I guess, help finance, or gave money to 900 funerals.
Yeah.
Usually we have a mortality rate of 250 per year of members. We don't do descendants, we do members. And so that was shocking, to say the least. But just for our Blackfoot people, we have a type A blood grouping, mostly. Now it's kind of getting diluted. We used to have about 99.9%, now we're at about 80%. So if we had listened to those studies, we would have taken the steps to help ourselves, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's also a thing about health equity in there and sovereignty. We had big fights with the government, including myself, about keeping us safe till there was a treatment available, till there was a vaccine, or there was effective treatments. So we were lucky, actually. The government did mostly agree with us, and they essentially shut the country down and shut the borders, which saved, I mean, I got it, I was really, really sick. I couldn't believe it. You know, I've got non-Indigenous friends. They're hugely overweight. They're older than me. They got diabetes. All these kind of things. They were fine. I was, after 24 hours, I was crawling out of bed. Just constitution-wise. But if you think about the sovereignty issue, was the government going to help us protect ourselves? Because when you are colonised, you don't have that kind of autonomy, you don't have that kind of control. We took it into our own hands a bit, but we had a lot of the Māori communities that set up our own roadblocks, and I know a few people, in this part of the world, did set up our own roadblocks. So there were stories of men with guns in boats, puttering around, making sure nobody landed on the coast. I don't know how true that was, but one of those man stories. And we absolutely fought and pressured the government to do what they could to keep us safe, because we knew we'd be vulnerable. So it was one thing to say, well, yes, we are vulnerable, but it's a whole other thing, well, what is actually going to come out of it? Where are our spots of resilience? What's going to come out of that? And for us, our resilience was actually working together as a people and doing what we needed to go do, and in some cases regardless of what the government said. So Oh, there were people, they were saying, oh, those terrible Māori people, they've set up their own roadblocks. You know, there's this fear of the brown hordes. They're going to take over, they're going to, you know, do all these things. And letters to the paper and ringing up the police and things. We still did it. And that's what helped save us, actually, was the fact that the police didn't turn up and drag us away, and that we were able to do that. But you know, so that's where the struggle for autonomy and the you know, I think I mentioned with research being connected with the struggle for autonomy over our own well-being, and that's COVID's a really good example, because it was a struggle. We did achieve some autonomy, and a lot of us, probably including myself, didn't die. But there was racist, right? It was racist commentary. You know, when a white person who was a doctor and whatever came up, and they could be doctor of grass growing. Oh, look at their opinion. That's really important. We'll stick that right up there. And that person was saying, oh, well, why should we have roadblocks? Why should we do? Well, got to get used to it sometime. Let's just live with it, you know, where the fossil fuel companies didn't like the shutdowns because they lost a lot of money. Those kind of things, just saying. Not that I'm paranoid, but really. They had all this sort of stuff about, you know, the colonisation stuff. And you'd seen, I mean, we had an example of an Indigenous leader, this is Colin Tukui Tonga. He's a public health expert, 30 years of experience all through the Pacific, a very, very knowledgeable man. And he was described as a community leader. Well, if he was white, he would have been described as an expert. And his opinion would have been up in the front page in big letters and not stuck down the back at the bottom in the brown section that we have, you know. It's that racism or people making decisions for when it won't affect them. We had a lot of very wealthy business leaders having their photos taken and saying, you know, we don't want COVID restrictions, you know, this is all silly. I mean, essentially they knew, and we knew at that time, that it was Māori people who were going to get sick and Māori people who were going to die. It was the sick, the poor, and the brown were the ones who were going to die. And we had the people making the decisions about how protected we would be was not out of any of those communities. Sick people, the brown people, poor people were fairly often rule 3. You know, did we have a seat at the table for COVID, the COVID response? Not really. And so that's where the racism comes in. You know, they were essentially saying, it's fine if all these brown people die because my business will still go and I'll be fine, I'm not going to get it, or if I do, I'm not going to get that sick. So, yeah, COVID, I have a whole thing about COVID. Big fights with the government. But again, you know, it's what we do with our knowledge and what we do with this struggle for autonomy, this struggle to self-determine who we are and how we do it is always so hard. You know, prise those fingers off that steering wheel and put ours on. Is an ongoing struggle, but we can all do it. You know. Any other questions? Comments? Oh, this is a friend of mine called Chris Bryant. He's an artist, and these are mountains. So he made these in ceramic. So. Yeah, they do look like tops. No, and we actually have a traditional toy that's a spinning top. But no, they're mountains. They're representative of the mountains in our area. From when you look up from our plains, you see those mountains. One of those is Rope, who a short story. I like this story, so I'm going to touch you. The volcano. So every now and then, you know, we get this massive flipping, you know, bright thing come up, and you might get a bit of dust. Sometimes you get some sulfur gas, but you know, we're not afraid of it. We've been there for a long time, you know. But you see in the paper, you can tell what ethnicity someone was by what they say about it. Oh, it was scary, and I thought I might have to run away, and this sort of thing. You know, they're not an Indigenous person. You say, oh yeah, that's neat, isn't it beautiful? But there's this neat story of this holy man, and this was back in the days of the early migrations, when there was migrations throughout the Pacific. And there's this story of this holy man who was the first to come across this huge white-capped mountain, and he decided to climb it. He had the feeling he should climb this mountain. So he was going up, and a blizzard set in. And he was about to freeze to death, but the place he came from had these fire beings, bird-type things. And so he called out to these firebirds to come to the mountain, and they came across the Pacific to him. This is such a cool story. I can just see it in my head. And they settled in the nest of the mountain, and he was warmed by that, and he survived. So that's the story to do with our mountain. So when we see, you know, a bit of smoke coming out the top, a bit of steam, you know, we look at that and we feel good. We're not afraid of that. But it's, knowing your land and knowing your history. So if somebody were to mention that mountain to me in a bit of research, I would know what that meant to them, because I know that story. So it's a cool story. Yes?
No, it's one of the comment. I really think it's a lot of information you shared. I'm very thankful about it. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Oh, thank you. I was worried it was a bit boring, so because it was so information heavy. So thank you for saying that.
No, I just wanted to comment on just the overall sharing of knowledge and what researchers have been doing. And it's, come to my attention because I'm still learning my culture. But how it was told to me was, it's those kind of questions that it's a way of life when you go and learn. Because it's designed for us to live healthy. It's designed for us to go seek that knowledge. And once you reach a certain level, a certain right, it gives you that right for that certain information, the sacred information. So, and when researchers come and try to extract some of that information, it's almost like an elementary student trying to go into a university class and take parts of it.
Yeah.
So the whole idea of information in our culture, it's designed for us to learn and to live it, to be healthy.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I just thought I'd comment that.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how many, when sort of the anthropology person over here, but when non-Indigenous anthropologists have come and they've studied us, because a lot of the early writings on our people were not done by us. And so you have these very, very, for us it was European interpretations of us. And when you read them, you can, especially once you get to a certain level, and I think I know my knowledge has greatly increased, not from the university, but from going and talking to the elders, and they've been so wonderfully generous with their time. But that's what's shaped my mind and my understanding. And now I look at those kind of things, because when it was an undergrad degree, I didn't know. I just said, so someone saw this and someone saw that, and this meant that. But now I can look back after 20 years or so, maybe a bit longer, and I can see how colonised our knowledge has been. And one of the things that happened to us was, because when the colonists came, there was the white male was the supreme person in society. And so when the missionaries came out and things, so our myths and our stories were subtly rewritten to bolster the male in the story, to create the male hero, but without a female counterpart. And that was because of the way their thinking was, because they saw power in the male. So when they wrote our stories, they naturally wrote about the powerful male, and the stories of powerful women were not written about. And so, again, I think a bit like you were saying, that when you look at these things without the knowledge, then, what are you trying? You don't know what you're trying to interpret, and then you reject things that are just so important because you just don't see them. They don't go in your head. So we have all these stories about the male hero, but very few of the female. So that's been corrected. They were trying to correct that. I mean, when the treaty came round for us to sign, most of our tribe didn't sign it. I think only about 5 chiefs did. The treaty came round, and actually from a band I'm related to, a woman came to sign, and the British said, no, we can't have a woman's signature because under the British system, women had no power. They had no property rights. They had no rights over their children. A very powerful, wealthy woman might, but it came through her male relatives. So when they saw a woman come to sign the treaty, they said, no, she can't sign it. And so that band turned around and said, well, we won't sign. If you won't let a woman sign, we're not going to sign at all. And they walked out. But that's, again, that mindset that comes from another place about who's powerful, who has authority, who's credible. And if you don't step back and see that Eurocentrism, you're not going to know that it's there. You just sort of tend to accept these things. But the stuff, I have to say, the old knowledge, and I'm sure it's the same here, the old knowledge is still there. We spent a lot of time worrying that it was lost, but actually, talking to the old people, it's still there. And I can encourage all of you who are researchers in this room, please go out and talk to the old people because they're not going to be around that much longer, and they have this incredible knowledge. The 97-year-old I spoke to told me how, she still had a native accent, and she told me how speaking English twisted her mind and made her think things that she didn't really want to think. But because it was the English language, she had to twist her mind to be able to speak it and to be able to live in that world, which I thought was really interesting. So, we can go back and talk to those elders about all those things, and redress some of that inequality and inequity that's come out of it. We had some interesting experiences with missionaries too, but that's a long story, so I won't go there. But we had the same thing with missionaries who would essentially rewrite our stuff according to Christian principles when we didn't have them. So, oh yeah. Oh well, this is a bit of a story. There are a few little. I think there's. Oh, here we go. There's different feathers. This one here. It's a kiruru. He's a forest bird. You see, I don't know if you can see it. If you get it in the right light, it shines bright green. So he's a big fat bird, and he gets drunk because we have a season where we have this big fruit that ferment, and he gets so fat that he either can't fly or he's too drunk to fly, and he flops down at the bottom of the tree. So that's this one. There's one in here. There are some of the native swan feathers in here. Some of the little. We actually have black swans, but they do sometimes have some white markings, so there's some of those in there. This one is actually an Australian emu because it's very much like one of our traditional birds, but the traditional birds that this type of feather would have come across have all died. They're extinct. And there's another type that there are still some left, but they are so rare that we don't make things out of them anymore. So it's a traditional take modern take on a traditional thing, but some of the older cloaks are so beautiful because when the colonists came, they brought pests. We were a land of birds. We had the world's biggest eagle, just saying, Hokio, which means God's friend. He was a big forest eagle, and he was big, and he ate these big ostrich-type birds. Were actually as tall as the ceiling. They were very, very large, and this forest eagle could actually take a person. It had talons the talons and bones and things are still around. So when the colonists came, we said, yeah, there's a forest eagle, it got claws like that. They didn't believe us. Then they found the evidence, But, most of our birds are gone because we had a bird for everything. Birds for running around the ground, birds that ate little things out of, but just birds everywhere because we didn't have any big predators. So when the Europeans brought stoats, weasels, the European rat, they absolutely devastated our bird population. I mean, they only survive normally now, a lot of them, in offshore islands and things that are kept predator-free. So our whole ecosystem was absolutely devastated, and some of our people were pushed into starvation. because of the changes that were made. You know, so our feather cloaks are very precious to us because it's that link with our heritage of the days when we really lived amongst the birds, and they're very important to us symbolically. And, yeah, it's sad, but we do what we can. We try to keep from extinction the ones that are left, but the colonists had they just burnt our forests to the ground. When they came, they didn't see our forests, they didn't see this wonderful land. What they saw was money. They saw logs because we had these trees that were thousands of years old and straight. So, of course, they were cut down for shipping. They cut down almost every one in the whole country. So forest burnt, and then they just burnt what was left and then turned it into farm. So we're kind of a giant farm now. But the trees, we had this forest of trees with girths like that, and they were absolutely huge. And now there were so few, they have names. Each one that is left has its own name, because there are it's unimaginable to me that someone can come in and absolutely devastate a land and think that that's okay. I mean, I know people thought differently then, but how could you think that's okay? I don't know. So there's Tane Mahuta, who's the biggest. He's the biggest tree left. Absolutely enormous. He's probably born before Jesus was. He's over 2,000 years old. We're a little worried he's going to die. We have a new fungal disease that's come in as in devastating what trees we have left. So, yeah.
What's your forest fires? I know that it was on TV, big forest fires down there.
We did have some surprise because we don't really have forest fires. So it surprised us greatly when this part of our native forest that was still left caught fire and burnt, because it's very rare. I think with the climate change thing, I think we could lose the rest of our forest and maybe the rest of our animals, but we're doing our best. So, oh yeah?
That was all really sad, but I want to end on a happy note.
Oh yeah, sorry, we got into the sad part.
Also just saying thank you for this presentation. I feel like I learned more in this hour than I have in my entire doctorate.
Oh my goodness, that is a compliment.
And you came a long way, so I really want you to know how much I appreciate
it was a long way. The other side of the earth, quite literally. Yeah.
I'm in a doctoral program in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. So it's an Ivy League institution, and there are 3 Native faculty members. One doesn't teach, one is in the veterinary school, and one is retiring. And
what?
I have never learned. I've had tons of methods and methodologies and ontology, all these courses in anthropology.
They never told you this?
I've never been taught by an Indigenous person.
Oh, what?
I've never had the way that you have explained it and broken it down and made it feel like I can do this too. You've kind of taken a layer away that we, in anthropology, I don't know, it can be very intimidating. So
Yeah, I know,
really
because
appreciate
there's this thing of our knowledge systems are the knowledge systems.
Yeah.
And you do it this way, and this is what we value, and this is what you will value, and it's so hard to fight against that. It really is. I know.
I appreciate you sharing the research that you have done and how you teach it as well, and so just thank you.
Oh, look, I'll if I ever get happy to come and do a workshop at your uni, just whoever wants to come along.